Hello, my lovelies. Just the other day I did a talk at a meetup here locally in Las Vegas area on grain and gluten and what's the big deal. Something that we have come to understand, and it's really quite staggering, is that the gluten-free industry right now is at a staggering $16 billion industry. I mean, that's pretty huge. Everybody seems to be getting on this gluten-free bandwagon, and we want to kind of ask a question. What is the big deal? Is wheat public enemy number one? Is it at the root and the reason behind so many of our diseases and rise of autoimmune conditions? It quite possibly could be. The rise of ADD, ADHD, autism, again, all the autoimmune conditions, including but not limited to type 2 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, various skin conditions such as psoriasis and eczema, and a rise of just many different types of conditions. Is really possibly wheat and gluten maybe part of this whole quagmire. So in order to understand, this is really interesting, in order to understand where we're at today in this world of wheat and gluten, we need to kind of take a step back, a long way back, and understand a little bit of the historic content and context. So when were grains actually introduced to humans? Now, if you were to ask that of a paleo community individual, they would say that, well, grains were introduced about 10,000 years ago when there was the rise of the Fertile Crescent, and that was the beginning of modern agriculture as we know it. So they kind of point to that as being the first onset of men departing from kind of a primal, ancestral type of eating habit to something that's including more grains. I just got a message coming up on my phone, so sorry about that if I hesitated. So, but now this is quite interesting because we recently have come to understand through some archaeological findings in Madagascar that actually about 105,000 years ago they have discovered tools, or let's say crude instruments inside of a cave that had markings of sorghum wheat and sorghum flour on it. So that's quite a ways back. Now, of course, sorghum is a wheat and a grain that's used even today traditionally in a lot of African dishes. And we suspect that it was really more of a porridge type of a food that they were eating, but it's definitely indicative of the fact that actually grains were introduced much, much earlier into human consumption than we initially anticipated. What was the wheat of the Fertile Crescent? The wheat of the Fertile Crescent was actually emmer wheat and also einkorn. Einkorn was really like the first wheat that was seen in the time of the Fertile Crescent. A very simple wheat. It only had 14 chromosomes. It was hardy, it was rough, it was hard to digest, but it was broken down and it was used. And this is a really critical thing that we need to understand also. It was used seasonally. You know, the USDA has never done us a good thing here when they introduced in their pyramid some years back that we are to be consuming, what was it, like 5 portions of carbohydrates per day, and they were actually specifying more that it would be breads and grains and wheats, and they did not do us a favor by doing that, because since that has happened, we've seen an incredible rise with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and you know the history there. So what is this very interesting einkorn wheat all about? Well, as I said, it's got 14 chromosomes. It's simple, and that was actually the first wheat to arrive on the modern human scene in terms of modern agriculture, let's say. Now let's kind of fast forward to about the 17th century. That wheat was also pretty much the same coarse kind of peasant type of grain of really the 10,000 years prior. Also the wheat of the 18th century and the wheat of the 19th century. It's when we get into the 20th century that we start to see some changes in the wheat and in the way we are cultivating it and in the way we are milling it. And actually, when we come fast forward to 1980, that's when we see a complete metamorphosis in terms of wheat. It's kind of a lot of different factors that created this perfect storm of this mutated wheat that we now have in our present food supply chain. Let me tell you a little bit what was going on. So number one, wheat has always been, the original wheat anyway, has been tall and thin and very easily destroyed by various types of inclement weather patterns, whether it would be tornadoes in the Dust Basin of Kansas, whether it would be hurricanes, bad weather conditions, could destroy whole crops and whole fields of wheat in a matter of days. So the scientists needed to come up with a type of wheat that would be hardier, would be shorter, and not so prone to destruction when these inclement weather patterns would come up. So that was occurring. Then the other thing was there was a tremendous amount of world hunger that was being seen in Africa. Many nations were starving, and there was great famine. Mexico needed to become very stable in their agricultural department. So this all kind of conglomerated together with a meeting of the minds in a laboratory outside of Mexico City, actually east of Mexico City. And the gentleman that kind of spearheaded this whole project and created what we now know as our modern wheat, and there are thousands upon thousands of strains and grains and types of wheat today. But this gentleman actually went on to receive a Nobel Prize for his contribution to the wheat industry, because in essence it did answer the tremendous need of starving countries. So in that way, yes, he is to be commended for that, but it also created an incredible onslaught of some things that we had no idea would occur, and a lot of that is health related. So in the 1980s, mid-1980s, they were in a laboratory east of Mexico City working on a type of grain and many types of grain that would be a dwarf grain or a semi-dwarf variety, where it would also be able to really stand up to, as I mentioned earlier, tremendous high winds and tornadoes and things that would damage fields. However, in all of this rush to hybridize and create this new wheat through genetic mutations, basically, we now have a wheat that has been morphed into something completely unknown to human consumption. And in fact, these are proteins that have been hybridized that are completely structurally different from the original grain that we knew, the einkorn grain or the emmer grain. Completely different. Thousands of new strains of wheat have been created without a single effort at safety testing to see whether or not this would be okay for human consumption. This is where the travesty and this is where the tragedy occurred. It appears to me that they were in such a rush to get this wheat created and out into the public that the very basic question of, is this going to be okay for human consumption, was never even addressed. So, Mexico City, we have a problem. Could it be today that some of your favorite foods, pizzas, bagels, pasta, breads, could be actually giving you some of the terrible conditions that people are facing in the gut, the brain, the skin, mood reactions, what we know as intestinal permeability, also called leaky gut, is definitely a condition that is implicated in grains and wheats as we know them today, because these are proteins that our body has never known to digest before. We don't catch up so quickly in terms of our DNA and our genetics. We don't move so quickly from the original humans that we were thousands of years ago. We don't morph that quickly so that our genetic structure can take in and adjust to some of these new proteins, the gliadins and the glutinins that we see today. So these are definitely some of the things that we need to consider when we consider grains as we know them today. When we walk into the grocery store and we see the breads that line the shelves and they seem to be able to last in our homes forever. I mean, we can, maybe 5 months from the time they were purchased, they can still be kind of plump and soft and in the bag. It's really quite a travesty that this is kind of food that we are producing in our country. But this type of wheat that we are seeing now is really very problematic, and it's really at the root of many of our sicknesses, diseases, autoimmune conditions, and maladies that we have today. Not to mention that also the presence of glyphosate in our atmosphere. It used to be more of a common practice. It isn't now so much, but where wheat farmers would harvest their crops with a spraying over of glyphosate, because what that would do is it would create, in the death of the grain, it would create that head to become completely open so that there would be a richer harvest. But then you have this residue of the glyphosate on the grain that will never come off. Now they don't do that practice as often, but it was done at one point in time. Regardless, there is glyphosate in the atmosphere. It's in the cotton fields, the soy fields, and all of these fields are side by side with each other, and all it takes is some wind, and that glyphosate is going to be, carried over into the other farms, which is why we say that even organic farms are not innocuous to this glyphosate problem that we're having. And we see it all over. So intestinal permeability, where the villi, which is kind of also called the shag carpet of our intestinal lining, gets permeated. It gets holes get permeated inside of it, and that's because of proteins that we cannot digest, that we cannot consume. And this is what happens, and then our body begins to attack itself, and this is where the autoimmune conditions of non-celiac gluten sensitivity comes in, or celiac, and other autoimmune conditions as well. So this is really quite a concern of ours. Not to mention, one of the biggest stealth killers is how gluten affects the brain. We cannot underestimate that. We now have evidence, and we now have very good clinical findings that gluten, glutenin, and the proteins within the common breads and protein within the common breads and whole wheat industry today is very much implicated in ADD, ADHD, also Alzheimer's and autism, just to mention a few. So really, this is why when there was this kind of huge cry and rush to rid people of gluten over the past, let's say, 10 years, for good reason, because it has had definitely collateral damage on our health as a nation. I mentioned earlier, even skin conditions are very much implicated with gluten sensitivity. So what are we supposed to eat? What really are we supposed to eat? I would go so far as to say, and I embraced, and I still do very much, a gluten-free lifestyle as much as possible. But I am beginning to shift gears here a bit and understand that in season, when the time is right, according to the circadian rhythm of nature and our body, and when that time is needed for us to have these grains, which are basically a beautiful picture of hormesis. So what is hormesis? It's when there's a slight irritant or toxin that is in our body that actually is good for us because it creates more of a robust immune system, and it helps us to be able to fight off and ward things. So a little bit of it's like that saying, what is it, that the toxin or the poison is your medicine in a way. So I would advocate that if you know you can get a good source of sourdough bread, or you can make your own, even better yet, get a starter and make your own, I would say that that would be something, as long as you are not celiac. And actually they are even doing tests on celiac, and celiac patients are able to eat an organic, natural, well-made sourdough bread. So that's very encouraging. I would say that we could go that route. I would say we could go the route of finding a ancient heirloom grain einkorn or emmer, and make sure that it's, again, organic and it is GMO free. I would say we could go ahead and maybe make our own bread there, as long as that's what we're using. So I think that we can reintroduce grains into our diet, but we have to be extremely wise in how we do it, know the sources, and make sure that we are eating it seasonally and not according to the FDA 5 times a day or whatever. That is absolutely ridiculous and uncalled for, and nobody needs that kind of heavy-duty starch and carbohydrate, simple carbohydrates in their system. So I hope this little video, which isn't so little anymore, 16 minutes, I hope this has given you a bit of an education into this whole conundrum and thought about, wheat, gluten-free, what do we do? The reason why, just again in closing, why I am not advocating gluten-free products is because they are all highly processed. When you read the list, they contain many times things like tapioca flour, rice flour, potato flour, sorghum, but they've all been highly processed. They've all been highly refined. So again, you're looking at a highly refined, highly processed bread that you're introducing to your system, which is going to be high on the glycemic index. And again, it's a processed, refined product that is not going to sit well with your body. So this is Christine signing out. A little bit of information here on what the heck are we supposed to do about eating bread. I hope you enjoyed this. Take care.